Before the Mayflower, before highways and European colonization, stories were written on the earth, left behind by people whose stories aren't easily found in textbooks. Nokee, the last of the Great Lakes mound builders, is a book that asks us to listen to a history that was nearly erased. Through the fictional character of Nokee, who was the last keeper of an ancient tradition, we're brought face to face with a culture that shaped the Great Lakes landscape long before it had a name on a map. Mounds are not simply monuments of the past, they were living places where ancestors danced, cried, and convened. These massive buildings were raised by human hands, often shaped like animals and aligned with spirit and season. Steve Rheaume is the author of Nokee. He is also a former federal biologist and geo-hydrologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. He's here to talk about memory, loss, and what it means when a civilization survives with fragments of his history lost. Steve, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's begin with the book itself. We're setting the scene. It's the 1600s. At the time in the world, history, there were battles and wars happening among the indigenous tribes, but it also included the arrival of Europeans and increased fur trapping and trading by the French. Why did you choose this particular time in history to tell a fictional story about that complex time in Michigan?
Well, that's an interesting question. To start with, I picked the 1600s because that's when we started having recorded history. You can imagine before that, the Native Americans had an oral history that they would pass down the stories, but it wasn't recorded. So much of that stuff in the past was lost. I had to actually, the mound builders lived in Michigan for thousands of years, between 2,000 and 5,000 years ago. They built these fabulous cities along our river systems. They had vast trade networks that spread for thousands of miles, and they also built these burial mound centers, as you just described in your wonderful introduction, that they would have to move by hand thousands and thousands of bags of dirt, baskets, in order to create these mounds up to maybe 50, 60 feet tall. And then they would bury their dead in those mounds. The reason I had to pick the 1600s, as I said, that's when the story of the French fur trappers came in, and with them came the black-robed Jesuit priests that had the ability to record that history. And that information went back to Paris and was then published in the Journal of the Jesuit Relations, and we can now, even to this day, go to those records and read about the history of that period. But I had to make that leap from the year I'll say the time of Christ, to 1600s, so I had to look for who would have been the last ancestors still living of those mound builders, and that's when Nokee comes into play.
Wow. And it kind of drops you right in that moment when you open the book and you start to read. You almost are disoriented because you understand the names that are being called out. If you're from Michigan or from the Great Lakes region, you understand those names. But then when you are dropped in this moment, you're just like, oh my gosh, let me get myself together and let me get my mind wrapped around. They're right near Grand River. They're right near, the Detroit River. It's very, very fascinating for those who really, really enjoy learning about or reading about Michigan and all of the history in Michigan. But where else does this story take us geographically? We're in Michigan. What part of Michigan are we in?
Well, first of all, just in brief, the story begins on the streets of Quebec City. It travels through 5 of the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi. The particular time when this story is being cast is when Father Marquette and Louis Joliet, 2 famous historical figures in Michigan history, come into Michigan, and it was a perfect time to introduce this indigenous last ancestor. But as far as Michigan goes, when they arrive, they come right into the book carries, without giving away the whole story, but the book carries the indigenous tribes arriving at Belle Isle, for example, and from there, that was where the first fur trading post was located by the French in the early 1600s, and from there they could actually see 2 mounds from Belle Isle that were on the Michigan shoreline that obviously now have long been excavated and removed.
So,
But it will take you, the story will continue to take you right up to, it crosses over into Lake Michigan. You go up the Lake Michigan side, you'll go into Sault Ste. Marie, and it'll take you all the way over to Green Bay and down to Mississippi. So it's not only, hopefully, it's an entertaining story, but you'll learn a lot about geography and reading the book as well.
that was one of my biggest takeaways when I began reading the book was I'm getting a geography lesson right now. I'm learning so many new things about Southwest Michigan or even just the Three Rivers area as well. The book does include the geography, of course, of the 1600s Michigan. It's interesting reading the book, envisioning these places. Why was it so important to highlight to you and really make this not just historically accurate, but you're also, accurate with geography?
Well, I would say the reason I could do that, as you said in the introduction, I worked for the federal government for 35 years. Yes. First, I worked on research, fishery research boats in the Great Lakes, and I traveled all around Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and northern Lake Huron. So I got a feel not only for the resources of that lake, but the immensity of it. And that was important when I started writing about how long it would take these people, my characters, to travel from one location to the next in a voyage of canoe. And you can imagine it was a time-consuming effort to get from place to place. But also, I will say that by working for the federal government, I worked on all the rivers and drainage streams to the Great Lakes all across in all 6 or 7 of the Great Lakes states. And doing that, I spent a lot of time in the field, and I kind of got a feel for all those different places that I was at. I was able to describe the topography and the environment that these characters would pass through with a good feeling that anybody from those areas reading the book would say, yeah, this makes sense.
Yes, it felt that way to me. But I do want to get to the mounds themselves because you have an interesting story about it. Indigenous peoples and their societies have often been painted as small groups that didn't have modern cities or maybe even civilization or engineering to a great degree. But when you were seeing those mounds for the first time, what were you seeing and what made you think, oh, wow, this took a lot of engineering and thought to make?
Well, I'd like to tell people this. I probably shouldn't even admit it, but 10 years ago, I knew nothing about the mound builders. Yeah. And then I made a trip down to central Ohio, and I visited a place called the Hopewell Culture Center. And at that center, when I got out of my vehicle, I found a 300-acre earthen wall complex, all built by hand. And inside of that was about a dozen of these burial mounds. And there was a sign that said, inside these mounds were buried the chiefs and shamans of the past with intricate items that they would need for their travel into the spirit world. Well, that sounded intriguing to me. And then they had a museum there run by the Park Service, and I went in there, and there were glass cases in there that were filled with these artifacts that they had actually excavated from these mounds. And I saw these white, well-crafted spear points. There were soapstone carved platform pipes that were in the shapes of animals and birds. I even saw a black obsidian knife from the Rocky Mountains. There were engraved seashells from Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, and there was even a copper bird that came from the copper mines of the UP. One last thing was that really impressed me was a sheet metal, a hand of sheet mica that came out of the Allegheny Mountains. And it said to me when I looked at it, I said, these people 2,000 years ago were master craftsmen. They had these long-distance travel routes. I said, and I know nothing about them. But what really did for me was when I looked at a wall, there was a map. And that map had been created by the Smithsonian Institute in the late 1800s. Before we had all the people coming across the Allegheny Mountains into the heartlands, they said, we need to map out where these people were before these sites were destroyed. And the map looked like it had measles. There were so many sites on the eastern side of the United States. And I looked at that map, followed it up to the north, and hit my home state of Michigan. And I said, there's hundreds of mounds in my own state, and I don't know anything about it. So I bought some reference books. I went home and started visiting libraries to do my research. I made trips across Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia to visit other mound sites. And then I even joined the Michigan Archaeological Society to attend lectures and discussions and see artifacts from these people. I was hooked, and I actually wrote a research paper, quite extensive, that gathered all my information in one place, put it aside on a shelf, and 4 years ago, I picked up that book, that research paper, read it, and said, this is too good. People got to hear about this. Somebody's got to write a book about these people, make it entertaining but educational. And the thought came to me, why not me? So I wrote the book.
Why not you? And in the book, once again, like you said, it started as a research paper, it's turned into this beautiful fiction, a story. But right now you're listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham. We're talking about a new book set to release this month titled Nokee, The Last of the Great Lakes Mound Builders. And, Steve Rheaume is our guest today, and Steve is the author of the book as well. Steve, once again, going back to the book, my brain is in so many different places because the book, it takes you for this ride. And I want to talk about the ride that you were able to take us on through history, through Nokee himself. Now, Nokee is the lead character. I don't want to give away too much and give away too many spoilers, but Nokee is the lead character in the book, and he, is sent on a quest, and he's locating different mounds. Can you talk about using Nokee in this way to uncover his own history, but also to uncover that history for us?
Well, the whole theme of the story is that when they do meet Nokee, and when he wants to keep his story alive, of course, he was like 16 when he was separated from his tribe that was fleeing the state of Michigan. So being a young kid, he doesn't know the whole history of the mound builders. The only one that does know it is a shaman that's on the other side of Lake Michigan somewhere. So they set off on a quest to find him, okay? Well, in order to do that, they travel as they say, most of the time is traveling through Michigan. As you said, they're down there in St. Joe's. They're over there in Muskegon. They're working their way up the Mackinac Island and working around. And the whole point of the Jesuits, they tell Nokee, not only do we want to get these diaries back to France, we want to document these mound sites as many as we can. And an interesting part of the story is that there's many people speculate how did the mound builders end, and the archaeologists and anthropologists have different ideas. Some say it ended when tribes from the east came with their bow and arrows and overpowered the mound builders around 500 A.D. But there's a different version that I put in the book, and I won't tell you it, but it's an interesting thing of how the mound builders actually came to a conclusion by invasion of a different group of people. Yes. Very, very interested to finish that up.
And, for folks who may not be interested, they've been listening to our conversation, based on your research and the book, of course, what is a mound for people who still are a little confused about what mounds may be?
A mound is simply an accumulation of a lot of dirt. They would usually it's generally believed that each new chief would have a mound started for their reign. And the first burial would have taken that land surface. And then they would put dirt on top of it and cap it and prepare it for the next burial. In the Michigan mound builders, it's believed they were different than a lot of the other mound builders. They believed that all people from the tribes were buried in the same mound. So it was a community mound. And they would conduct cremations of the bodies or put them on scaffolds, and then a year or two later they would gather up all the bones or the ashes, and they would have a yearly ceremony when they would bury these leather bags in the mounds, and then the whole group would recap the mound for the next series of burials. And it was very much a team effort, and I kind of like that attitude of the Michigan mound builders.
Yeah. And my last question to you is, the goal is to record Nokee's history. That's one of the major themes of the book. You get the Deacon's diaries back to Paris, France, and preserve that history before it's lost without spoilers. Nokee learns a lot on his journey and understands it needs to be preserved. So what does that message say to the current generations of all people living in our current time, especially as we are starting to see a lot of erasure happening in terms of certain folks' histories?
Well, that's the saddest part. I mean, I got involved in learning about the indigenous culture years ago when I was a kid. I loved reading stories about the ancient Indian tribes. And in particular, you remember, of course, who wouldn't have wanted to read about the Incas and the Mayas and the Aztecs and all the gold, and who wouldn't want to go gather all that gold? As a kid, I thought, what a treat that would have been. But then I read the book, The Last of the Mohicans, about James Fenimore Cooper, and how it hit me how much by colonization coming in here, not only did we take the resources of the people, we stole their culture. And the people, when they lost their culture, they just faded away in time or were forced out of the area they were living in. And that hit me pretty hard. And I said, let's try to bring that out in this novel of Nokee.
Steve Rheaume is the author of Nokee, The Last of the Great Lakes Mound Builders, published by Mission Point Press. He is also a former federal biologist and geo-hydrologist of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. The book will be available February 26th. Steve, thank you so very much. I cannot wait to finish the book because it is a ride.
Thank you very much, Dia.
Coming up, a series of conversations at the College for Creative Studies aim to inspire students to creatively design a better environmental future. Stay right there. We'll be right back. This is The Metro.